This hearing is fairly virtual, so I'm going to address a few things that Kyle did not talk about with Housekeeping Matters. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If you notice, or I notice, that you haven't unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like staff to unmute you. If you would like, indicate by nodding your head and staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies, and you can see the clock up in the screen there. If there's a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice, as I said, a clock on your screen that will show you how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel, my mouse, to remind members that their time has almost expired. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the other member. I will just start recognizing the other member once it turns red. In terms of speaking order, we will follow the order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member. When members are present at the time that the hearing was called to order, they will be recognized in order of seniority. And finally, members not present at the time of the hearing is called to order. And I'm going off script for a minute. We're going to try to put the order on deck for speaking on the chat. So look at your chat screen, and hopefully we'll get some feedback, and maybe if that works for members, then they'll know when they're up. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided to your staff. So that takes care of the housekeeping. Last month, the subcommittee held a hearing on budget trends and potential trajectories of defense spending in the next 10 to 20 years. As I mentioned, I want the subcommittee to use our time before we see the FY 2022 budget request to think about larger themes, what priorities we want to direct funds towards in the upcoming budget cycle to address future challenges. This is another hearing in that series. This morning, the subcommittee will receive testimony from two of the foremost experts on the subject of climate change and national security. Sherry Goodman is a senior fellow with the Polar Institute in Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center. And retired Vice Admiral Dennis McGinn is an advisory board member of the Center for Climate and Security. We look forward to both of their testimonies. There can be no doubt, at least in my mind, that our climate is changing. The Department of Defense and the entire federal government must be prepared or suffer the consequences. In the last few years, we have seen historic hurricanes, catastrophic damage to Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. Those hurricanes seriously impacted the Air Force and Marine Corps operations and cost taxpayers millions of dollars. In 2019, the historic Mississippi floodwaters overflowed onto Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, posing a threat to U.S. Strategic Command operations. These are not isolated climate incidences. Climate change is a national security threat to our nation now, and the threat is growing. The largest federal consumer of energy, is the Department of Defense. It has a responsibility then to play a leading role in making its systems more efficient and to curb emissions in order to reduce these catastrophic events. And that's why I'm pleased in his first week of office, President Biden signed an executive order which requires the following: the Director of National Intelligence to issue a report on the national and economic security impacts of climate change, the Secretary of Defense to develop a climate risk analysis that can incorporate into modeling, simulation, wargaming, and other analysis. And finally, the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to consider security implications of climate change in developing the National Defense Strategy, defense planning guidance, the Chairman's risk assessment, and other relevant strategy planning and programming documents. These actions are long overdue, and I thank President Biden for leading on this critical issue. The changing climate will impact every corner of the earth, but nowhere is it more pronounced than in the Arctic. As a former social studies teacher, I can say many Americans don't realize that the United States is an Arctic nation. I have a map here, and you can look at it, and I handed out a map before. This is my moment to be a social studies teacher. You need to look at your map and look at Alaska and look at how we are part of the Arctic Council, folks. So we must ensure that the Arctic region plays an appropriate role in our national security planning. Our adversaries, they're active in the region, and we must be ready to respond from issues relating to thawing permafrost, affecting installations, or our ability to train and use equipment that can survive in extreme environments. We must ensure the freedom of navigation through the Bering Strait. And these are just some of the important topics to discuss. With that, I want to thank everyone for participating in today's hearing, and I'd like to recognize our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Calvert, for his comments.
Well, thank you, Chair McCollum. I appreciate that, and happy St. Patrick's Day. And I apologize for some of our Republican colleagues won't be on the conference this morning because we have our Republican conference meeting this morning, so some of them won't make it or be on late. But let me extend a warm welcome to our distinguished witnesses as the United States continues to focus on our national security strategy on great power competition, specifically threats arising from a more assertive China and Russia. It is important that we be attentive to other non-traditional challenges. Over the years, the Department of Defense has periodically assessed the effects of a changing climate on DoD missions, operational plans, and installations. A report to Congress in 2019, for example, noted a range of severe related events impacting our military installations. It discussed how a changing climate can create insecurity, increasing demands for humanitarian assistance, and how it can create unanticipated vulnerabilities to mission execution. Perhaps the most notable impact of changing climate to our strategic environment has been in the Arctic, as the chair mentioned. According to a new report by the Atlantic Council, a geopolitical friction over resources, territory, and transportation channels suggests the Arctic is likely to be one of the 21st century's most contested areas. With that in mind, I welcome Secretary Austin's announcement that the department will take appropriate actions to incorporate climate change considerations in DoD's activities and risk assessments to mitigate this driver of insecurity. I look forward to hearing from our experts on these issues and begin our assessment of the Department of Defense budget for the fiscal year 22. Again, thank you to our witnesses for appearing before us. And with that, Chair, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Calvert. To the witnesses, your full written testimony will be placed in the record, and members have copies at their desks. In the interest of time, I would strongly encourage each of you to keep your summarized statement to 5 minutes because we're going to have to leave time for questions. And I want you to be complete, as succinct as you can, also in responding to our questions so we can get more in. So Ms. Goodman, we will start with you. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Calvert, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I have over 30 years of experience as a national security professional. I served as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security in the 1990s, and for 14 years at the Center for Naval Analysis, now at the Wilson Center and the Center for Climate and Security. The views I am presenting today are my own. As my Navy colleagues like to say, give me the bluff, the bottom line up front. Okay, here's mine. First, climate change presents a direct threat to U.S. national security that must be integrated into defense strategy, planning, and programs at all levels. Second, the U.S. must prioritize climate change in its security engagements with allies and partners. And third, the Department of Defense can lead by example on clean energy, resilience, and climate predictive capabilities in a way that both serves and supports our military mission and enhances American leadership at home and abroad. I will focus my opening remarks on the first point. My colleague, Vice Admiral McGinn, will address points 2 and 3. Okay, a bipartisan Congress has already spoken to the unprecedented threat of climate change to national security. In the FY 2018 NDAA, Congress stated that climate change is a direct threat to the national security of the United States and is impacting stability in areas of the world, both where the U.S. armed forces are operating today and where strategic implications for future conflict exist. As far back as the 2008 NDAA, Congress directed that the national security implications of climate change be included in the National Defense Strategy, the National Military Strategy, and the Quadrennial Defense Review. The CNA Military Advisory Board, which I founded in 2007, comprised of senior U.S. retired generals and admirals, including Vice Admiral McGinn, identified climate change as a threat multiplier, recognizing that climate change can exacerbate political instability where food, water, and resource shortages already exist, often in the world's most dangerous and fragile regions. But it's also here at home. Impacts from extreme weather and sea level rise also pose threats to military installations and strain our military readiness in the U.S. and around the world. As you mentioned, Madam Chair, the losses at Camp Lejeune and Tyndall Air Force Base from hurricanes Florence and Michael in 2018 are estimated by DoD to be approximately $3 to $5 billion each for each base. So we are already paying for this. And as the ranking member noted, a 2019 DoD report identified 79 military installations facing climate-related risks, including flooding, drought, and wildfire. The National Guard now responds to humanitarian type assistance, both at home and health-related and around the world, and is straining our military resources and readiness. These factors have implications for our ability to project power and influence around the world and can constrain our capacity to effectively advance our interests abroad. For example, China is exerting greater control over resources and supply chains, from PPE to energy, both domestically and to gain power in and influence over parts of the world, including the Arctic, Latin America, and Africa. In some cases, the U.S. will need to compete for influence, where China is taking advantage of climate change to improve its military posture in the South China Sea or become the relief provider of first resort to vulnerable Pacific Island nations. In the Arctic, China and Russia are exerting greater influence in an opening Arctic due to climate change, which is emboldening their actions. China has declared itself to be a near Arctic state with ambitions to build a polar Silk Road across the region. Russia envisions a toll road for shipping and transit across its northern sea route and seeks to enforce this maritime route as an internal waterway. As risks increase from commercial activity, the U.S. must increase its preparedness and its search and rescue capability. In sub-Saharan Africa, while not the sole factor, climate change has contributed to political instability there as well. Already, changes in precipitation patterns and droughts are exacerbating existing tensions among farmers and herders in the Sahel. In the past year, climate change-related flooding contributed to instability in East Africa, a region already strained by the pandemic, rising food insecurity, and a locust plague. As the head of the World Food Program described the events of 2020 in the region, it's shock upon shock upon shock. So DoD can lead by example, and Vice Admiral McGinn will address those specific ways in which using resilience, technology, predictive capability, and clean energy can help address these challenges. In closing, Congress has strengthened and should continue to strengthen authorities, programs, and funding available to the department to address these threats. Climate-proofing our security is essential to protect America's 21st century near and long-term national security interests. Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Calvert. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you. And it sounds like we're going to have a testimony that really is going to build and complement one another. So thank you both for coordinating that. Vice Admiral McGinn, you're next.
Chairwoman McCollum, Ranking Member Calvert, distinguished members of the subcommittee, first order of business, happy St. Patrick's Day. What a wonderful and great a day to have this important conversation. I have over 35 years of experience in the uniform of the United States Navy. I served for almost 4 years as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy from 2013 to 2017 for energy, installations, and environment. And importantly, I have over 15 years experience in the private sector, working challenges and opportunities in energy and environmental issues, including climate change. Secretary Goodman very succinctly framed it with the three bottom lines up front and very effectively summarized that first critical point that climate change indeed presents a direct threat to U.S. national security. So I'll pick up on the second two, that the U.S. must prioritize climate change in global security engagements, and that the department must lead by example. As Secretary of Defense Austin has stated, quote, "There's little about what the department does to defend the American people that is not affected by climate change." He referenced specifically our national security strategies, operations, and infrastructure. When it comes to U.S. security engagements around the world, we have stated in our own Center for Climate Security Plan for America that the Defense Department should develop a security forces climate engagement plan to promote regular military to military and civil military international engagement in order to enhance the operational resilience of U.S. allies and partners and to enhance United States influence vis-a-vis its primary competitors. Importantly, combatant commanders around the globe should engage allied and partner nations' militaries in adapting to climate change and working to mitigate the adverse effects to military operations, energy resilience, infrastructure, and readiness through a variety of pathways. Everything from formal intergovernmental negotiations under NATO or regionally focused military and civil security planning forums. The third point of framing our bottom lines up front, leading by example. As the nation's largest user of energy, as you pointed out, Chair McCollum, DoD can lead by example in key energy and climate technologies that align nicely with the military mission. Here are just a couple of examples. Electric vehicles. The Department of Defense leases 166,000 vehicles from the General Services Administration every year, according to the fiscal year 20 Strategic Stability Performance Plan. The department can help diversify its transportation energy sources, reduce operational costs and carbon footprint, and also help to scale up and accelerate the transition to net zero transportation through the use of electric vehicles of all types, non-tactical, and rapid deployment of charging stations on DoD installations. Microgrids and resilient transmission infrastructures. The Department of Defense needs to be able to carry out its critical military missions on key installations, despite the growing threats of cyber attack, severe weather such as ice storms, wildfires, hurricanes, floods, or even deliberate terrorist attack. That is why military bases practice, quote, black start exercises to recover from a power outage and maintain operations for extended periods, even if the grid is down. The technologies and practices needed to ride out these threats, including microgrids, distributed energy systems, and advanced energy storage methods, will have the added benefit of promoting resilient infrastructure throughout our civilian communities. Climate predictive capabilities. From military operations planning to resilient base infrastructure, a new generation of Earth system observations and predictive capabilities that provide asset-level climate data analytics for shorter term, hours to weeks to months, planning is becoming increasingly available both in government technical centers and in the private sector. As DoD adapts these technologies for the military mission, it will further reduce risk to both operations and to our military infrastructure. In conclusion, our nation's energy, economic, and environmental security are the critical foundations upon which our overall national security and quality of life rest. The essential leadership role of the Department of Defense in facing the challenges of climate change can effectively turn those challenges into great opportunities for America and for our partners. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. The members on this committee, before I became chair, heard me ask all kinds of questions about the Arctic and talk about some of the challenges in Africa. So I'm going to save my questions now for the end of this round and let Mr. Ryan go next. Mr. Ryan?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for prioritizing this hearing. I think this is a critically important issue, and as our witnesses have testified, this has far-reaching implications for our military, our economy, our country. So I want to say thank you. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. Glad we're getting right to work here on St. Patty's Day. We celebrate later. I've got a couple of questions, and I'd like Madam Secretary Goodman and Admiral, again, both to kind of take a crack at this. You mentioned the electric vehicles, electrification, and how important that is. I want to kind of take a half a step back here, and I've had conversations with the chairwoman about this. The ability for the Defense Department to spend money, to procure things, is an awesome amount of buying power, and I think can shift the market in significant ways, whether we're talking about electrification or anything else. If you could just talk to us about, we did a call a couple days ago with the Energy Subcommittee with Bill Gates and his new book about, saving ourselves from climate disaster. And part of the conversation was about moving into kind of green steel and cement. And have we done anything within the Department of Defense, or have you looked at anything to say, we're going to give preference to, as we're building things, we're going to give preference to those companies that are moving in that direction? And I know we're not there yet, but can you see that as a significant way to really begin to also be a part of shifting the market towards a greener economy? And the other one I'd like you to touch upon too, we buy billions of dollars worth of food to feed our military. And one of the more progressive ways of capturing carbon is through sustainable and regenerative agriculture. So is there a way that we can say we're going to give preference to General Mills, for example, just to pick a random company out of the country, but General Mills, who is buying farms to do regenerative agriculture to supply their own food production? I just think if we're going to do this, there are kind of ways that maybe are one layer deep or two layers deep that could really begin shifting the market. I mean, if the Department of Defense said, we're going to give preference for food contracts for those food production companies that participate 30% in regenerative agriculture in the next how many years, or whatever we would do, we could significantly start capturing carbon and really moving the market. So if you could just comment on that: steel, cement, regenerative agriculture, how do we really do this in a big way, aside from the technology and the other things that you mentioned?
Okay, thank you very much, Congressman Ryan, for that question. It was about a decade ago now that the Department of Defense established energy as a key performance parameter in its acquisition system. And that led to being able to prioritize energy for the purpose of ensuring that there was adequate energy in our weapon systems for performance. Prior to that, we'd always assumed we had energy at the front. The next step, and there have been a variety of efforts to green the procurement chain, supply chain, over the years. For example, I remember fighting hard to have recycled paper at the Pentagon back in the 1990s. And we were deploying the first generation of hybrid vehicles in the vehicles DoD leases from GSA. Now there's greater opportunities to advance that with electrification. As you note, in certain sectors, DoD does have substantial buying power because of its own mission needs. So where those mission needs align, and I'd say that given the president's executive order and the Secretary of Defense's strong statement, and including the climate working group that's been now established in the Department of Defense to look at various lines of effort, there will be an effort to look at how appropriately to green the supply chain across DoD, and that would include potentially, where cost effective and meeting mission needs, the ability to, as you say, acquire either more agriculture that's based on more regenerative properties that conserves resources, as you say, conserves water, and leads us to a next generation, as well as in the energy supply chains. As you know, DoD's been an exporter of technology for many years, from the internet to GPS, and I see that potentially could happen again in some of these areas.
Great. Admiral, quick, any comment there, real quick?
I think your question is right on the mark, Mr. Ryan. I agree that the Department of Defense has tremendous buying power. Indeed, the entire federal government, and using that buying power in a very careful way. We don't want to spend money on much more expensive goods and services for DoD or for the entire federal government. But there are so many ways that we can put our thumb on the scale towards more sustainable products, whether it's steel, cement, agricultural products. These are industries that in many cases are very, very close to very economic scales. And by using that buying power to accelerate and extend the scale up of these goods and services, I think it's right on the mark. We don't clearly want to waste any money. We want to make sure that we're getting good value for every dollar, but we can do that in a way that has the double goodness of providing necessary materials to the Department of Defense, and also provides preferences for American industries and American agriculture that can really have a beneficial effect across the economy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great question, Mr. Ryan. Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this question probably both our witnesses may want to participate in an answer. As I mentioned in my opening testimony, there are about 200 bases in the United States, and the military maintains and operates hundreds of other facilities abroad. The need to climate-proof key military installations can be readily handled by seawalls, improved infrastructure, reliance, and as a worst case, relocation of bases to less vulnerable locations. What percent of our bases at home and abroad need to be climate-proofed today, and what will that cost? Can the military leverage the private sector to incorporate new technology in future military construction projects? So either Ms. Goodman or Admiral?
I'd like to have Ms. Goodman go first, because then I can say I agree with everything Secretary Goodman said.
Okay, fine.
Okay, thank you, Vice Admiral McGinn. Okay, Congressman Calvert, it's a great question. You know, almost all of our bases really need to be climate proofed and made resilient. As was noted earlier, we're already paying billions of dollars to rebuild Tyndall Air Force Base, Camp Lejeune, and Offutt from the hurricanes that occurred in the last few years. So we need to flood proof, hurricane proof. We need to address permafrost at bases in the Arctic where it's collapsing. So as we do this, we will, if we do it smartly, we will invest for the future. We will also be working with our communities in a way that makes them more resilient too. And in programs that Congress has authorized and appropriated to, there is increasing collaboration among communities. And I would say that is very important to continue because bases are part of their communities, whether it's in Norfolk or Annapolis or all around the country. And there are opportunities to do this in a way that helps lift up and make our communities and our bases and their military families stronger.
I would add, Mr. Calvert, that we have to have a prioritization system. Every installation in the United States and around the world could use more climate proofing, if you will, or the additional of resilient design. But there has to be, because of budgetary considerations, a keen sense of priority. It is not a question of if, it's a question of when. Climate-driven severe weather is coming to an installation near you. It can be any form. It can be wildfires out west. It can be flooding. It can be severe weather, hurricanes, etc. So the idea is to look at those installations that are most vulnerable to the various types of threats and to try to invest in resilience. In many cases, it's not a lot of money. It's mostly being thoughtful about how you design a base, where you put things. For example, if I have a building on an installation that's in a 100-year floodplain, probably be a good idea not to put the computers in the basement of that building. Just locate critical functions in areas that are going to be less vulnerable to flooding or other effects of wind or heat or whatever. I think also thinking about how we actually use construction materials. Cross-laminated timber is really, really seeing a resurgence. It's as strong as steel for very, very large buildings these days. So using different materials can really have a double effect of good strength and also sourcing from very, very sustainable industries.
And let me just add, I think the private sector will be doing most of this work because that's how DoD will seek technologies, whether it's climate predictive capabilities or new resilience infrastructure. And there are going to be great opportunities for Americans at all levels across the country through the private sector, from firms big and small, to do the work of making more resilient our military infrastructure.
Well, I know I was over at Camp Lejeune shortly after the hurricane damage, and a lot of those facilities, of course, were built some time ago in a hurry during World War II and other times. They weren't built to the code that we have today, and a lot of those facilities, certainly at Tyndall, were the same. But so today's building techniques, I think, more engages what we need to do. I would hope. One issue, real quickly, on energy. These new small nuclear reactors that we're using more and more of around the country that have exciting capabilities. I hope we are looking at using those as small energy sources at various military bases.
I would say most emphatically that nuclear power has to have a future in global energy portfolio. The development of small modular reactors of various sizes is in fairly early development stage. I would say that probably in the 10-year time frame when we would actually have them in a form with the kind of function that we would want to have on various military bases. They are part of a portfolio of energy choices, but I think we should, as the United States, boldly look at what is the future of nuclear and how can we make it a part. It's not a silver bullet, but it's part of a whole array of energy technologies that are emerging that can really, really help to diversify our energy sources and provide a lot more resilience.
I would add nuclear has an essential role in our energy future. And also, Congressman, the Uniform Facility Code that DoD uses is being updated to account for the climate resilience it needs when it rebuilds its bases now.
Thank you. Some of the same questions I had, Ken, good questions. So Mr. Ruppersberger.
Okay, well, yeah, well, first, thank you, Chairwoman McCollum, for putting together this important hearing today. As a member who represents the Chesapeake Bay watershed in Maryland, I'm glad to have these distinguished panelists before us today to help us and the Department of Defense be a leader, not a laggard, on the issue of climate change. Now, coastal communities like my district in Maryland are home to 42% of our country's population and millions of businesses that supply most of our country's populations and millions of businesses that supply most of our gross domestic product. We must better position the department to tackle this problem. It is both a moral issue of protecting the planet for future generations and a very real national security threat that our panelists today have so eloquently highlighted. Now, the question is to both of the panelists, the security posture balance in the Arctic region has me worried. More the ice cap melts, easier it is for nations to ignore the norms of security cooperation in the Arctic and employ a go-it-alone strategy in the region that has historically thrived on geopolitical cooperation because of the operating environment is so unforgiving. Now, Ms. Goodman, in your testimony, you mentioned how important it is for the U.S. to lead on this issue, to better enable our hand in geopolitical negotiations that concern the Arctic. In your opinion, how big of a role does access to the region play? Does purchasing platforms that enable our access to the Arctic show our commitment to enforcing norms, or does it create a zero-sum game, or both?
Congressman, thank you for that question. I do think we need to up our game in the Arctic. We have a plan now. The Coast Guard has got an approved plan by Congress to build 6 new icebreakers to replace our aging 1.5 fleet. We need to move forward expeditiously with that. Our Department of Defense also needs to increase its Arctic capability. And in the last year, all the services, the Air Force, the Navy, and just yesterday, the Army have issued new Arctic strategies. These are important to tie together now at the overall Department of Defense level to have an integrated approach to the set of Arctic capabilities that we need. So I'm hopeful that we will take a whole of government approach, because deterrence really is the best defense by increasing our ability to meet our potential adversaries in the Arctic. That's way we can hopefully continue to keep the peace, but at the same time, reduce risk of miscalculation of an accident that could require a search and rescue or a misunderstanding. What sometimes keeps me up at night is increased ship traffic through the region. As you said, vast, still difficult to operate in. If communication among vessels and increasing exercises have already led to tensions when U.S. fishermen were found in areas where the Russians were exercising in the Bering Strait last summer, and the U.S. and Russia are only 30 miles apart at their narrowest point. So it's important for us to increase our presence in the region in order to keep the peace and keep stability.
Okay.
I would add, Mr. Ruppersberger, that in addition to the traditional security threats that Ms. Goodman just outlined, the Arctic is having other effects. We have become familiar over the past few years with so-called polar vortex and the tremendous harm that can do. Most recently in Texas and in Oklahoma. Another aspect that is, I guess, more scientific, but nevertheless ominous, is the warming tundra in the Arctic tundra is releasing a lot of methane hydrates from deep below. There have even been explosions as this methane builds up, leaving craters at 100 meters deep. So the Arctic is very, very important, and it's just a real indicator of the climate changing and the potential for very, very bad effects coming from that.
Okay. It's, I was in Alaska with the commandant of the Coast Guard about a year ago, and literally right up to we could see the glaciers just melting away right before our eyes, and that's got to affect the sea level issues that we're all dealing with right now in the coastal areas.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Cole, I believe, has stepped out for a minute, so that will lead us to you, Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for this very important hearing we're having today. And I really appreciate our guests that have come to talk about this. The number of renewable energy projects in the U.S. military almost tripled from 2011 to 2015. In the Army, which, as everyone knows, I represent Fort Hood, his goal is to get to 25% of energy consumed from renewables by 2025, and to be zero by 30. Fort Hood, Texas, right now,
Okay, I got it.
50% of its power from renewable energy. 63,000 solar panels are on site and 21,000 off-site wind turbines are producing 65 milliwatts of power. How can the Department of Defense further lower energy costs and installations, as well as operational energy consumption and costs?
I've been impressed, Mr. Carter, by the tremendous deployment of especially wind power and increasingly solar power in Texas. It is a good example of us diversifying our energy portfolio in what is effectively the energy capital of the world by getting less expensive, more sustainable, renewable power as part of that critical, resilient energy portfolio. And I think that not only DoD, but the entire economy is benefiting from the combination of renewable energy, solar, wind, and the addition of storage capabilities, batteries, if you will, and pumped hydro that can really help us to have sustainable and very much less expensive sources of energy.
And as a backup question, you mentioned storage. Since I've been in Congress, that's been the big stumbling block on renewable energy. Where are we on battery storage? Is DoD actively engaging in the research it takes for battery storage? Because I know the industry is trying and trying, but at least the last time I looked, they weren't successful.
Couple of things near term. Yes, the DoD is always doing good research related to energy storage in partnership sometimes with NASA for state space operations, but increasingly as we deploy unmanned systems, surface, air, subsurface, they're going to need better energy storage and batteries. So that will contribute to the overall knowledge base. However, the cost of batteries, the capability, the energy density of batteries is increasing significantly, and that is good news for many applications, military and civilian. A little bit further term, let's say 5 to 10 years, the deployment of what is called green hydrogen is going to really be making a difference to capture the energy from the sun, from the wind, other renewable sources, and use it to maintain a base load effectively of energy power for our various major grids as well as microgrids.
If you're going to convert to electric cars, the range of electric vehicles right now is, I guess, probably the best range they've got is around 400 miles. So, and the average of them is around 200 miles. So in that situation, how does that fit the overall battle plan of American warriors with limited resources, and how do you refuel on the battlefield?
I believe that the focus on electric vehicles initially for DoD will be primarily on non-tactical, what I would call non-tactical vehicles. The good news is the industry is producing greater battery density and therefore greater range of electric vehicles of all sorts, whether it's a bus, a minivan, or a sedan, or even pickup trucks. I'm personally waiting for a good F-150 electric. If they can do a Mustang that's electric, I think they can do a good pickup truck as well. But I think the good news is that the electrification of our transportation system is going to be good for our economy, first of all, and it's really going to be good for local, regional, and of course, global environmental quality.
Well, being from Texas, pickup trucks are really important to me too. And when they said they were going to have an F-150 out, and then they backed off of it, it was discouraging for me too. But I hope they'll be victorious soon. Thank you,
Yes,
Madam
sir.
Chairman.
Well, as a granddaughter of a Ford mechanic in Montana, all this has been very interesting, from Mustangs to pickup trucks. Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for holding this hearing today. I got a dozen questions, but I'll try to keep it to two. My first is for Ms. Goodman. We're seeing threats like rising sea levels and seismic shifts and shoreline erosion and erratic weather patterns that really have the capacity to compromise the security of military bases across the country, including naval installations. Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in my district is undeniably vulnerable to climate change and represents a single point of failure for carrier maintenance in the Pacific. Um, in response to the growing need to counter threats brought about by climate change and to shore up our public shipyards, the Navy created an investment strategy called the Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Plan, or SIOP, which is a 20-year, $21 billion effort to modernize these shipyards, to increase their climate resilience, to improve resistance to earthquakes and other natural disasters. That's one piece of a multifaceted solution necessary to address a problem the size and scope of climate change. Another that comes to mind, although maybe not directly created for this purpose, is the Defense Community Infrastructure Program, DCIP. That's a program created in 2019 that was designed to address infrastructure deficiencies in communities surrounding military installations. And those grant funds can help to preserve military readiness and security. And I'm thinking examples of, off-base infrastructure that may be vulnerable to climate change. It strikes me that Congress needs to work in coordination with the DoD to keep these programs like PSYOP and DSIP on track. I'd love to just get your sense. Do you think that the effects of climate change will outpace these mitigation efforts? And do you think it is, how important do you think it is for Congress and the DoD to look for areas to accelerate programs like the PSYOP and like DSIP?
Mr. Kilmer, thank you for that question. I think it's absolutely essential. Those are two good programs that you mentioned. They are critical. Only with that investment and ambition and commitment of the Department of Defense to these and other programs will we be able to ensure that both our military infrastructure, for example, in your key district and in many others, becomes resilient to these climate threats, rising sea levels, extreme weather events, ocean acidification in your region as well, as well as water scarcity, flooding, drought in other regions. And so those are two very important programs. And what's particularly important about the second one you mentioned is the opportunity to work with the community, because I think that's also essential. And I'm pleased that Congress has continued to broaden the authorities for DoD to invest in conjunction with communities, because some of these investments are better done when there's a cost sharing. For example, that program you mentioned has cost sharing. Also, the REPI program, the Readiness Environmental Protection Initiative, enables cost sharing between communities and DoD, and that's also going to be continually important in those areas and others in order to maximize the benefit. So thank you for raising that. I think these are very important programs for our future.
Thank you. Admiral, I wanted to follow up on Ranking Member Calvert's question. It seems like another way in which the DoD can be part of the solution is through innovative building materials. The department's one of the largest builders on the planet. You mentioned cross-laminated timber. I think there's a real opportunity there because it has a smaller carbon footprint than steel and concrete. It comes from a renewable resource. CLT isn't alone. We've seen incredible uses of recycled composite material. In my district, we have something called the Composite Technology Recycling Center that incorporates recycled carbon fiber into products to reduce weight and increase strength and promote sustainability. I want to get your sense, Admiral, what steps would you recommend to ensure that the DoD is taking advantage of innovative and alternative building materials? Are there enough resources being invested into developing new technologies, and how can Congress help on this front?
I think promoting, it's a great question, promoting interaction between the public and private sector, in this case DoD, and the building, advanced building industry is really, really critical, so that we break free of the old model of stick building on site, that we can move towards modular construction, new materials like CLT, and really, really take a look at how we actually design buildings, how we design facilities, so that they are, by design, very, very much more efficient, and effective and resilient. So I think that what the Congress can do is in guidance to the Department of Defense, indeed to the federal government and all procurement for buildings, to look for opportunities for public-private coordination, and to try to remove barriers that may exist from old legislation that prevents the type of partnership that really shares risk, shares reward in approaching our building industry in new ways.
Thank you, Admiral. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Kirkpatrick. Ms. Kirkpatrick?
And that will probably. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a couple of questions. My first question is for both of the witnesses. The Department of Defense is the single largest energy user in the United States, and energy consumption is a significant cost to the department and the services. So this is a sort of a follow-up question to Representative Kilmer's question. Transitioning to green energy in the department can introduce efficiencies and reduce logistical requirements. So I guess my question is, how can the department further lower energy costs at installations and as well as operational energy consumptions and costs? And are there enough resources being invested in energy innovation within the department?
Sherry?
Okay, thank you very, very much, Ms. Kirkpatrick, for that question. I think DoD has already invested a lot in recent years in improving its energy posture, but it can do more today. And there are many good, particularly in research and development to meet the military mission. There are some good programs, among them the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, the Energy Services Technology Certification Program, and a number of others also in the services. They do the good basic RDT&E. They do the demonstration validation. The challenge is to get over the valley of death and now deploy many of these new technologies for use. In your district, of course, we have one of the largest solar arrays, at Davis-Monthan, and that's important. We can do more of that now that the cost of wind and solar has come down, but as has been noted, there's more we can do in batteries, in energy transmission infrastructure, by setting the right targets, such as the Black Start exercises, which set a goal of being able to go without power from the grid for approximately 14 days. Those incentivize the right type of investment. And there will be other goals, I'm sure, that the Department of Defense will work on to help incentivize investment. And I think we'll begin to see that R&D pay off as we also get some spin out into the commercial sector and we allow technologies to come into our work.
I would add that an inherently efficient military force, whether it's Army, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard, Air Force, is a more effective force. You can go further, stay longer, and carry more of your the payload you have if you are inherently more efficient in an operational energy sense. Clearly, on the installation side, the same thing applies. There was a great study about, I would say 7 years ago, by MIT Lincoln Labs that took a look at the benefits of centralizing emergency backup power so that you eliminate individual diesel generator sets for scattered across an installation for emergency backup. They tend to be dirty, they tend to be unreliable, and they tend to be expensive to own and operate them and to procure them. So centralizing backup power, improving installation distribution is going to be a great contributor to greater resilience.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Quare has stepped out. Mr. Cole has not returned. So we're going to go to Mr. Christ next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this very important hearing. The Tampa Bay region in Florida, where my district is located, is one of the most at-risk areas for storm surge from hurricanes in the world, comparable, in fact, to Miami and New Orleans in that regard. It's been nothing short of a miracle that we've avoided a direct hit for a very long time now, since back before most of the area was settled and before MacDill Air Force Base, home to CENTCOM and SOCOM, was founded on the waterfront of Tampa Bay, including in 2017 when Hurricane Irma struck Tampa Bay as a major hurricane, while MacDill largely avoided damage from that storm. Admiral McGinn, what is the department doing to improve flood resiliency and installations like MacDill, where they are falling short, excuse me, and what can be done to either help them or push them to do even more? Please, sir.
I think, Mr. Chris, the first thing that they are doing is they're looking at where are their critical assets, the most vulnerable ones. What are the single point failures for mission? MacDill, of course, as you know, with all of those special forces, central command operations, absolutely critical that they can sustain any type of weather and continue to do the mission. I think that taking a look at where are their electrical system vulnerabilities, where are the necessary pumps to reduce or to mitigate flooding, where are critical buildings? Can there be a relocation, not writ large, but selectively to put critical functions in better locations or raise them up on upper stories of buildings, have methods of taking flooding in lower floors, but to be able to remove it, but still keep the lights on and the function. It's a very tough engineering challenge, but one that we have the ability to do. And I think our Navy CBs and our Corps of Engineers are very much up to the task, especially if they work with the private sector and the good ideas and innovations that are out there.
Great, thank you very much. There seems to be a misconception out there that the threat of climate change poses to our facilities is only from storm surge or hurricanes. And while that may be the case in many situations, the fires in California and the record-breaking inland low-pressure system that flooded Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska show that climate change can have consequences that are beyond what first was imagined. For either of you, what have we learned over the past 5 to 10 years about the full effects of climate change on our installations and defense infrastructure? And what is the department doing or not doing to respond thereto?
Well, thank you, Mr. Christ. Yes, the department has learned that it needs to address all the threat multipliers of climate change, from fires to floods, as well as sea level rise and extreme weather and drought in certain parts of the region, which affect water availability at bases and communities. At Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, that severe flood really showed what Vice Admiral McGinn just said, where it's the new command headquarters that was the newest building on the base and was built on higher ground, rode out the storm fairly well. It was the older, lower lying buildings that were much more subject to damage. So we've learned that the hard way. Now, the wildfire is a particular challenge out in the West, and that's going to require both reducing the fuel load, so changing how we manage energy overall, the fuel load in the forest, and recognizing that conditions have gotten hotter and drier, but also looking at new building materials, new energy systems, and being able to take further preventive action, being able to address these fires earlier on and reduce the fuel load so they don't get as dangerous.
I would add that we are in a race against time. The great author Tom Friedman has said, Mother Nature always bats last and she always bats 1,000. And I think that we are seeing weather phenomena that are literally unprecedented, certainly in modern history. So we really, really need to focus on resilience from all sorts of things. It's ironic that late last summer, California suffered widespread power outages due to the heat wave. Yet, just a few weeks ago, Texas and Oklahoma suffered terrible damage and suffering because of polar vortex. Hot, cold, the manifestations of severe weather are quite varied, and we need to be prepared geographically for the most likely ones.
Great. Thank you, Admiral. I see my time is up. I yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I haven't asked a question yet, so I want to kind of follow up on a little bit of a theme that we heard here, especially from Mr. Chris. So I'm going to talk about Tyndall Air Force Base and kind of what all happened there and paint a bigger picture. So in your written testimony, Admiral McGinn, you talked about the Category 5 hurricane there in 2018. Could you expand a little more about the type of damage the base infrastructure went through and the F-22 squadron sustained there, and then just about how we had to move resources all over, move aircraft, which has potential effect on our readiness? Could you just kind of paint a bigger picture of what one of these catastrophes really looks like in the broad sense?
Yes, basically Hurricane Michael coming as it did due south of Tyndall and the Gulf of Mexico, very, very rapid escalation to Category 5 when it came ashore, it did not allow a lot of time for preparation, although given the severity of the storm, the wind and surge, even more preparation wouldn't have significantly altered the damage. The wind force damaging buildings unbelievably. F-22s that were stationed there at Tyndall, not all of them were in a maintenance condition that allowed them to fly away to hurricane evacuation to inland bases. So those, because of the damage to and literally destruction of some of the hangars, were also severely damaged. So I think the lesson is we need to know that our installations are in the path of various severe weather events. In this case, along the Gulf, Florida, the Atlantic coast, hurricanes are clearly one of the most frequent and significantly damaging phenomenon. So we need to be prepared for that.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Capter. We're going to have time for a second round. So Ms. Capter?
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. And I thank our guest, Secretary Goodman, for sure, and Admiral McGinn. I'm very interested. I was one of the people back in the 90s that was fighting for an energy focus at the Department of Defense, and we finally got one to some extent. So I have a few questions here. Do you think the department has taken this newest challenge, climate change, and the initiatives related to it seriously in the way the department itself has structured its operations? Which military service do you believe has taken the lead? And if the answer is Navy, is that because, Admiral, with the warming oceans, you felt it first? I'm just curious. And then I would like both of your recommendations on where to go in our country or world where you see real innovation occurring at the Department of Defense, because this issue of climate change and energy gets lost in the mammoth nature of the department. Where can I go to look at real leadership in innovation and application in overground transportation, number one. Number two, hydrogen fuel cells, current generation and next generation, battery storage, and finally, base energy independence. I represent the first Guard base that flew a biofueled plane almost 20 years ago, and but it was an exception, not the rule. And it was on the cover of Guard magazine at the time. And we are very proud of that as biofuels have come online in our country. But I have found the department laggard. I don't find the department a leader. And in the clean energy mandate and in the area of innovation, it tends to get lost somehow. So I'm just curious, do you think that, again, the department has really taken this seriously, and are they structured to properly deal with it in the way that they have handled the assignment of duties inside the department? Which department has taken the lead? And finally, could you name me the three locations on overground transportation, hydrogen fuel cells, current and next generation, battery storage, and then finally, base energy independence? Where can I visit?
I would start by saying that the entire Department of Defense gets it, and they see renewable energy and various other forms of energy, including hydrogen, hydrogen fuel cells, and other means as a key part of their mission. In many cases, however, over the past years, the department has very wisely used commercial off-the-shelf energy technology. I'm reminded of our wonderful United States Marines in Afghanistan deploying commercial solar panels to forward operating bases in order to reduce the reliance on oil convoys, which were very, very deadly to our young men and women in uniform over there. But I would start, of course, with the Department of the Navy. We did do a lot there and continue to do a lot, but so does the Air Force. And the fuel research going on at Wright-Patt at the Air Force Research Lab is really, really helpful. And it's done in many cases in coordination or certainly trading technology stories with the civilian aviation. I think that the future for hydrogen is very, very bright as a storage medium and as well as a producer of electricity using fuel cells for both transportation as well as for on-site power. I would specifically point out that Secretary of Defense has named a senior climate advisor directly reporting to Secretary Austin. And his name is Joe Bryan. He is innovative, he's smart, he's experienced. I know this because Joe was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy when I was the Assistant Secretary. And he is a great example of the recognition of the need for science and innovation and asking the questions about why can't we move further, why can't we move faster?
DARPA, are they doing anything that you're aware of that's worthy?
I'm sorry, who was that?
DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. I'm looking for, where do I go for overground transport? Do I go to the Warren Tank Command? Where do I go to see the future within DoD?
Right. I would start with DARPA. That's a good spot. I would also check in the Department of Energy with the Advanced Research Project Agency for Energy, ARPA-E. And you would also want to take a look at some of the DOE laboratories and how they are coordinating in some cases with the Department of Defense laboratories and technology centers.
I would also add, Congresswoman, that I stated in my testimony, I've said elsewhere, I think the Department of Defense, in addition to the very good efforts that are already being made under the current Secretary Austin and the new climate advisor, Joe Bryan, could benefit from having a clean energy innovation office that pulled together a lot of the work some of the work that's ongoing and that can be further magnified by clear lines of investment, and also a clean energy transition fund to help us get over this valley of death. When there's good research and development coming out of our labs, private sector or government labs, sometimes there's a lag between getting it actually into use because the demand signal isn't always there at the buying level, and a transition office could help get us beyond that.
Thank you so much.
Excuse me, a transition fund.
Thank you, Secretary Goodman. And you think that should be within the Department of Defense somehow in its contracting operations?
I think it should be, and it should be modeled on other things we've done when we've wanted to spur innovation in other types of technologies.
Thank you. So, Ranking Member Calvert, we're going to go to a second round of questioning, and I'd like you to lead that off if you have another question.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, it's an issue. It's been suggested that increased probability of droughts, floods, famine, disease, loss of habitable land, other large-scale natural humanitarian disasters will create problems for communities and governments abroad. So to what extent do our geographic combat commanders need to factor in the potential impact of climate change across their spectrum of planning and operations? And secondly, if this should be a core requirement of the GCCs and how they undertake a cost-effective way without falling prey to institutional overreach and owning an issue that may more properly be the domain of the Department of State USAID and others in the interagencies. How do you approach that?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think it's vitally important that climate security be integrated into our security engagements security engagements, which are principally conducted by our combatant commands. You know, in the 1990s, when I served as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense in a different era, we were conducting environmental security engagements with each of the combatant commands to address the environmental challenges of that era, which were largely cleanup of contaminated bases, complying with air, water, and waste laws, conserving endangered species. That, of course, all continues. But today we're in the climate era, and those combatant commanders can use these same kind of environmental security engagements addressing climate security threats. For example, Pacific Island nations, many of them, you know, who depend very much on American security, see increased approaches from China to be the provider of first resort when they have an extreme weather event, are facing food and water insecurity. The U.S. should be right there working with them and in other regions of the world, and can do so, can integrate climate security into its theater engagement plans. And there are new improved Earth system observation capabilities that can be utilized to enable better planning and to be shared in some cases with our allies and partners as well.
I think the record of the United States military throughout the world, but especially in the India Pacific Ocean area, Indian Pacific Ocean area, is really remarkable, especially in terms of humanitarian assistance, disaster recovery operations. You just can't, as a combatant commander or any of the subordinate service commanders, avoid that responsibility. So I think, as Ms. Goodman pointed out, engagement with other militaries, other nations, civilian and military, about how can we do things together that will increase the resilience in a particular region, whether it's an island nation or a coastal nation, that will help to mitigate the worst effects of some of these typhoons and other phenomena that are coming our way increasingly in terms of intensity and frequency.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Oh, you're welcome. Great. These questions have all been fabulous, and the answers have been enlightening. Thank you. Mr. Ruppersberger.
Good, okay. Well, first thing, I'm going to go from the Arctic now to more global and my district. My district is a coastal community with many DoD entities, including armies, Aberdeen Proving Ground, and an Air National Guard base right on what we call Middle River of East Baltimore. I'm also chairman of U.S. Naval Academy Board of Visitors in Annapolis, which fights for funding every year to protect itself against sea level rise. In our most recent hearing with the Naval Academy about 2 weeks ago, Admiral Buck mentioned a strategy to address sea level rise, but he said it could take 2035 to complete based on funding levels, and that's just totally unacceptable. With sea level rising and the aging of the Naval Academy, they have real issues and problems with sea level. The Naval Academy just built their newest building, a cyber building, which was constructed and with a sea level in mind, rising in mind. And it's a pretty unique building to deal with sea level. But other than that, there are a lot of issues that are there. Now, I know that Ms. Goodman mentioned things that we can do for sea level, and one of those was to create, I think, the DoD a clean energy office and a transition fund. But basically, my question, how does the department, do they have the tools to assess this issue of global warming, sea level rise, and all of these installations? I think the last one I heard, in your testimony, billions of dollars it'll cost, and aging. So we really have to deal with this, where it's going to cost us a lot more money. And an example of that is the United States Naval Academy. So if you could really, what steps do you recommend? Some of Ms. Goodman had mentioned to better address these issues on a defense-wide basis.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I mean, Congress has already directed DoD to integrate resilience into its military installation resilience plans, and Secretary Austin has said that work is already underway. I believe the department now will begin to accelerate that work per the requirements both of the president's executive order and its own direction. And the question for the issue is going to be first doing the planning, but then, as you say, putting the money on the project, sort of invest in the investments that are needed. And as we all know, it's often the infrastructure accounts that are underfunded in the Department of Defense historically. So that's going to have to be reprioritized within the way the department does its investments. I'm pleased to say that I believe, the department is looking at that right now, how to set those priorities, how to ensure that critical facilities like the Naval Academy don't have to wait till 2035 to become more resilient. And this is going to require some new ways of doing business for the Department of Defense to give greater priority to the investments needed based on those resilient plans that will be coming forward. As you say, at the Naval Academy, they already have a plan. Other bases are coming forward in the coming year or so. And then those investments will have to be prioritized. And it's my hope that...
The Naval Academy plan is totally inadequate going out to the year 2035. It's not going to work.
Right. So there have to be some priorities set to occur within the next several years, probably, and certainly a substantial investment within what we call the FYDP, the 5-year defense plan. And so the secretary and the services are going to have to make some choices about those important investments.
Okay.
One of the positive aspects, Mr. Rubersberger, is that you, as the chair of the Board of Visitors, and Admiral Buck as the superintendent, you get it. It isn't a question of, gee, I hope we don't have a hurricane here or tidal surge up the Severn River. And knowing that it is inevitable will motivate the kind of thinking and investment in protecting these critical assets right along the river.
Well, it seems the timing is right for global warming, for dealing with these issues. You have the Secretary of Defense is making it a priority. Betty McCollum, our chair, has made this a priority. First hearing we basically have had. I've been on this committee for a long period of time. And I think the chairman and I have talked about maybe going to the Naval Academy so she can see some of these issues. And we'll probably do that in the next 2 or 3 months. So I think the timing might be right with all the players that we have here is going to focus on this issue so we can plan and including plan on what needs to be done from an infrastructure point of view to prepare ourselves, because the Naval Academy is not going to move. The water keeps rising.
Madam Chair,
you'll back.
Madam Chair.
Talk to Professor Flack,
Excuse me,
who
what?
runs the Mechanical Engineering Department at the Naval Academy, doing wonderful things over the years with educating midshipmen on energy and environment. That's Professor Flack.
Okay. I think Mr. Calvert was trying to be recognized.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, Madam Chair, the Naval Academy and other bases also, which is also a problem, is a lot of these bases were built on fill, and certainly the Naval Academy has a lot of it is on fill, and you have the subsidence that's occurring on top of it. So some of these areas are literally sinking.
Right.
And so I don't. Sometimes you can throw a lot of money at this problem, with seawalls and the rest, but if your underlying foundation is weak or failing, you may have to look at other considerations to fix it. I don't know. It's going to be expensive. I know that. Thank you. I just wanted to point that out.
I think that's a good point, and we've got a partner in Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz with Milcon. A lot of these are Milcon projects, but we know that they're going to affect our readiness and able to move forward. So I look forward to our committee not only working with the authorizers on this, but working with MilCon. There's certain things we can do. There's other things that MilCon does do. And I think this is a unique opportunity for the three committees to, really sit down and we could tell the story of what's happening. They can look at their budget for what's planning and then work with the authorizers on how to move forward. But we can't afford to waste any time. With that, Mr. Carter.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman, and being ranking member on MilCon myself, I can tell you that's a pretty small budget as it compares to DOD. And we have MilCon projects that are emergencies, and we've talked about a couple of them today. And we're gonna have the deep pockets of DOD involved in order for us to do this. I just have to point that out because the MilCon budget is a small budget as it compares even to the VA budget. It's a challenge.
Mr. Carter, ranking member of MilCon, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm just not going to go in somebody else's jurisdiction. So we will work together on that, sir.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Your question.
The other thing I want to raise, going back in history to when I was chairman of Homeland, is those icebreakers. We don't have the money for those things in the Homeland Security budget either. And we were trying to, and I think successfully, to partner with the Navy on that first one. I don't know if anybody knows whether that is still going on or not, but it's going to have to be a partnership with the big boys to get 7 icebreakers in the Arctic. But if we don't, we're going to literally lose jurisdiction in the Arctic.
Congressman, you raised an important point that adding 6 icebreakers into the Coast Guard's budget could be a budget-breaking effort for the small service that it is. And the Navy has historically had a lot of other priorities in its budget, other big-ticket items. And I think it's going to take a whole of government effort and a look from the top at overall what we need in Arctic capabilities, and to be able to set the right overall level of investment and then decide how it's going to be made across the federal government, because we have to be able to up our capability to have presence in the Arctic, both across the Department of Defense and across the Coast Guard and other agencies. Research in the Arctic continues to be very important so we can understand those changing conditions and plan and prepare our forces to be able to operate there. So there are a variety of agencies across the federal government that are very important. And thank you for pointing that out. It's going to take an effort coordinated probably through the White House with the relevant federal agencies.
And with all the climate change issues we've got in the Arctic, and with the shipping that's now going into the Arctic, the rescue mission of 1 icebreaker, which is that can be effective in heavy ice, and should there be a disaster in what we're now calling the Northwest Passage, it could be a real earth-shaking disaster if it was some kind of a cruise ship full of people and it got in big trouble, and to reach it without an icebreaker could be a real disaster. In addition to the climate issues that are up there and the jurisdiction issues, I wish we could. I want to keep emphasizing everybody's got to be thinking about icebreakers. We need them. Now back to my question, and I've still got a little time left. Oh, the Biden administration has set national security objectives. And then in those, their national security guidance, they mentioned near-peer competition, violent non-state actors, infectious disease, cyber attacks, and disinformation campaigns. Where would you put our climate change initiative, which General Austin and the Secretary put forward, where would you put that in the ranking of what the administration is giving? It's not included now as part of those national security guidances, but probably it should be. Where do you think it should be put?
I think I think it should be there with the others, and I believe it is included in the president's interim national security strategy. Perhaps not quite in that sentence, but elsewhere in the direction to address climate threats, and it should be included because it affects all those others. Changing climate, drought, and food insecurities are increasing the opportunities for extremists, violent extremists across North Africa, the Middle East, and in South Asia. And that brings our forces, your forces from Fort Hood and elsewhere are all called up to serve when our nation is threatened.
We're even there right now. To some
Correct.
extent. But I wasn't trying to question it. They gave us a guidance, and there was a conversation about climate change in there. That's correct. I think we should prioritize it.
I heartily agree.
Something that they put forward.
She's back.
And maybe it's being technical, but if you don't make noise, you don't get things done.
Exactly.
I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Capter, and then I know I have another question, Ken. We'll see if you do too. Ms. Capter.
There is a disadvantage to a few minutes. And I want to go back to my original questions from the last round because I didn't get clarity on where in the U.S. military we could look for a site visit to the place that is doing the most on advancing overground transportation in new energy systems. I heard what was said about ARPA and DARPA. I know them well. But I'm asking who's taking leadership in the same ways we have Blue Angels and they do air shows across the country. I really don't see the Department of Defense being a leader publicly in some of the arenas in which we so desperately need advancement. So for example, the Warren Tank Command, which is at the doorstep of every major U.S. producer in Michigan, they don't really take a public lead in terms of new transportation systems. They don't have a Blue Angels type show or anything like that that would inspire the public in this area. I don't really see any base energy independence pride in the way the military presents itself. So perhaps the gentleman you mentioned that's just been appointed to by Secretary Austin, perhaps he will be helpful in this. But I have found a real resistance or just lack of consciousness in the department in general, despite both of your stellar efforts to make a difference. So again, I ask, are you aware of any place in the department that is showing direct leadership in moving these critical sectors of overground transportation, new fueled flight, new energy flight systems, some of the storage arenas where we know that we have to make progress? Is there any base? Is there any person? Is there any division that you can point to? I know the Marine Corps has done an astounding job overall, but again, the department hasn't really coalesced its progress in any way that's understandable to most members of Congress or the American people. So I'm just pushing.
You raised such a good question. Here's what I'd like to see. You know, the Department of Defense has awards in many categories, and I'm familiar with its environmental and installation awards because for 8 years I gave them out as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, and we gave awards out at the installation and individual level for cleaning up contaminated sites, complying with air laws, complying with water laws, complying with waste, conserving natural resources, conserving cultural resources. And Denny Vice Admiral McGinn may have more familiarity. I think we should look to creating new award categories along some of the lines you mentioned, and that will encourage the competition and incentivize the department. It's not to the exclusion of certain funds that I mentioned earlier, but by creating an award and recognizing leadership in certain new categories, such as the ones you've mentioned, I think we will give the department an opportunity to bring its best forward.
Thank you, Secretary Goodwin. I'm so glad to hear you say that. Let me just point out when the air shows, if I go to the Air Force and look at them, when the air shows come, they always do a pre-show field display. And usually they have this giant truck that shoots flames out the back, okay? So the military's figured out how to do that. Why don't they bring forward new technology, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, or new fueled advanced biofueled vehicles? Why don't they teach the public? They don't do that after all these years. So I'm not yelling at you. I'm just frustrated as one member who's tried to make a difference in my little puddle, you know, and but I see this mammoth department and I don't see a rollout that's impressive. But
I would
thank you
say
for the suggestion.
the culture of the department is changing. I served in the Obama administration's second term, and there was a lot of emphasis on renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainability, environmental care, and that eclipsed somewhat over the past administration. That's unfortunate, but nevertheless, culturally, in the services, in the Department of Defense, people are still doing their job. I would point to Marine Corps Air Station Miramar out in San Diego as an example of an installation that has worked very, very hard to try to get to net zero. The Marine Corps down in logistics base, Albany, Georgia, has done a tremendous amount of work in terms of sustainability and energy independence from the grid if it is needed. So there are many pockets. I mentioned 2 Marine Corps bases. There are many fine Navy bases. Naval Base San Diego, right down the Chesapeake Bay from Washington, Patuxent River Naval Air Station. But I think this culture of really highlighting how important and essential sustainability and fighting climate change and turning the challenges into opportunities will bring out, if you will, the bragging rights of many of the services and many of the installations that are doing some really, really good stuff, including, to your point about transportation.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you. I'm going to take us back to the beginning of your testimony again and kind of wrap around it. We talked about, you know, the effects of climate change on our bases right here in the United States and some of our bases around the world. We talked about the effects of climate change in the Arctic and China and Russia and, you know, the extreme weather and how there's so much more work to be done there. But in your statements, you also mentioned about climate change just isn't happening here in the United States in the Arctic, it's happening all over the world. And I've had the opportunity to be in different parts of the world and experience what's going on with climate change, whether it's talking to political leaders or talking to people who live in those communities. So climate change can exacerbate environmental, social, economic, political drivers of instability and conflict. Climate change variability has intensified economic and resource insecurity across the continent of Africa, throughout the Middle East, leading to mass migration, the displacement of vulnerable populations, and that's part of what's happening in our border is climate change, with what we're witnessing with some of the people who are fleeing the effects of climate change in Central America. In turn, these populations, though, especially in Africa and the Middle East, are more susceptible to recruitment by extremist groups and exploitation by terrorist groups. So I'm going to give one example and then ask a question. So I've been in the area of Africa. I've been in Chad, and Lake Chad is a water source for more than 30 million people. It has shrunk to less than 1/10 of its size compared to just 50 years ago. It has led to population displacement in a region that's very volatile. And we know that extremist groups are constantly trying to get a good foothold in there. So what role can the department play in preparing for regional and global instability to major climate change events? And maybe you could give us an example, either in the Sahel or something that you've seen in Africa to round this off before I close the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, if you overlay in Africa our deployments in recent years to combat violent extremists, it coincides almost perfectly where the regions where we see the severest climate threats around the Lake Chad region, Mali, and Niger, and a few other locations across Africa. So, as part of our defense planning through Africa Command, for example, in particular, understanding the underlying causes of climate threats, the drought, the food insecurity, the shrinking of Lake Chad that has enabled Boko Haram and others on the Nigerian side to take advantage of vulnerable populations, that has sent herders, farmers, fishermen fleeing the region because they can no longer support their livelihoods and their families in that area. The long-term solutions to the climate challenges are primarily not through military action. They are going to be through development and diplomacy, through local action. In those parts of Africa you mentioned, our European partners are very deeply engaged, and climate and security activity in Europe very much means working with development and diplomatic agencies. I think we in the US should be doing more of that ourselves to round out the totality of our approaches. I think that's where this administration is headed in its climate security, foreign policy, and national security planning, to integrate those approaches so we have an integrated approach to the diplomacy and development that's needed in these regions to enable sustainable livelihoods, with military forces using their tools, their tools that are reasonable, whether it's security forces or combatant commander engagement as a backup capability to support further sustainable action.
And Chair McCollum, I would also point to South Asia as a critical area that is being affected by climate change, with shrinking ice cap and glaciers in the Himalayas that feed or don't feed, in some cases, the 4 sacred rivers that flow through India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. We have a recipe for regional strife as it's alternating floods in some years or drought in others from those rivers that have been so essential to sustaining the people in that region. We really need to make sure that we are engaging with those nations at the combatant commander level and really at the head of state level to make sure that there's some sense of unity to try to recognize the common enemy of climate change and to try to do some things to increase resilience and to reduce the adverse effects on populations in that very critical region of South Asia.
Thank you both for your testimony, and that's a good note to land on, because there's a role for the Department of Defense, as Judge Carter pointed out. There's a role for Homeland Security. There's a role for MILCON, but there's a role for the whole of the United States government to be addressing climate change, and that's why I'm so glad we're back in the Paris climate accords, because if we're not looking at this through the whole of government and working internationally with allies and finding new partners in this, it's just going to increase the conflict. And that is not anything that I've ever heard from our Joint Chiefs of Staff that they want to see happen. That the Secretaries of Defense have all said the best thing that we can do is to build towards more peace that'll help with their being able to provide security. So thank you both for your testimony. And with that, I will conclude today's hearing, and this subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.